number of distinguished panelists who know a whole lot about Russian hacking and disinformation. I'm going to go ahead and have them all introduce themselves one by one.
My name is Roman Dobrokhotov. I'm editor-in-chief of The Insider, which is an online investigative magazine, which is officially registered in Latvia, but actually is based in Moscow. So we're making investigations on very different stuff, and one of them is Russian governmental hackers.
Good afternoon. My name is Tony Gidwani. I'm the Director of Research Operations at Threat Connect. We are a threat intelligence company, so we work in the cybersecurity space. My team produces a lot of intelligence across a number of nation-state actors. We've done a lot of work pertaining to Russia. We also do a lot of work supporting journalists and civil society activists, which I'm sure is something that Eva will have us talk about today as well.
Hello everybody, my name is Cosimo Mortola. I work for the cybersecurity company FireEye. I work on a team called Information Operations, and we look at disinformation, propaganda. A lot of the focus right now is on, of course, Russian disinformation.
Good afternoon. My name is Alexis Dorejonka. Work for cybersecurity company ESET. I run the Montreal R&D office, and it's full of malware researchers. And one of our core interests is tracking nation-state actors, Fancy Bear, Turla, groups like that. So, looking forward to this panel.
Hello everybody, my name is Andrei Zakharov. I'm an investigative reporter from Russia, from Russian magazine RBC, and I was speaking here about disinformation. We made 2 investigations about the famous Russian trolls, including how they worked during, before and after the US elections. I think some of you maybe read this report because Google translated it, cleaned up the Google translation, and it's very good. And now for English speaking. So I will be speaking about disinformation. By the way, my presentation has already started.
Avert your eyes. We're giving things away. One of the first things that I wanted to say was sort of a framing device for this entire panel, which is that in the 80s, we learned a lot of new Russian words. We learned glasnost and perestroika. And in 2016 through 2018, we have learned many other exciting new Russian words, mostly kompromat and disinformatsiya, which Americans struggle to pronounce correctly, but I'm willing to bear with you. So here we're mostly going to be talking about disinformatsiya. And we're going to go ahead and start by talking about some incidents of phishing and hacking, because the way that this whole thing goes is you start with the phish and then you move towards the disinformation. So I think our first description of an incident is going to come from Roman. All right, go for it.
Actually, a year ago, we already have a panel on a topic which is very close to ours. And that time there were a lot of questions about how can we prove that Russian officials or Russian security services really are standing behind these attacks. And at that time we didn't have like 100% proof. So we had a lot of facts that were making us think so. But I think that for now we can be sure that at least one of these 2 big groups, which are known as Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. So one of these groups, which is called Fancy Bear or APT28, or also is known as a Pawn Storm, that this group is at least closely linked with GRU, which is Russian military intelligence, or actually maybe it is a part of a GRU, and we can prove it with actually different facts, but I would suggest our own investigation, which was I believe in right year ago, in May 2017. So it was after emails of Emmanuel Macron headquarters were leaked by Fancy Bear Group, and we and our colleagues from a Bulgarian investigative outlet Bivol found that in some of the letters that were like published by this group themselves, in metadata of some Excel files, we found some Russian words and actually a Russian name, Georgy Petrovich Roshka. So it seemed like there were actually thousands of letters, and it seemed that it seemed like they tried to decrypt some of the encrypted Excel files, which were about some financial data of these people who worked for Macron. So they tried to decrypt it and forgot to like delete the metadata of this letter. But this name didn't like ring a bell because it was like just some random name of a Russian person. So no one knew what does it mean, and we started to investigate who this person can be. And we found that actually we can find only one person with such a name, and he participated in a conference for like programmers or specialists of cryptology, and that also doesn't mean anything because like this person can do anything. But there was when you participate in this conference, you write down where you are you are working, and he wrote that he's working for some company called Evrika, which works with Ministry of Defense, but is not really part of the Ministry of Defense. Still, it was very interesting, and we contacted with this company, and they said that, well, we don't know this person, and no one among our people who work for us participated in such kind of conference in any year. Which was actually also interesting because there were at least 3 people who told that they are from Evrika. And many of them were very interesting because one of others also worked for a company that is linked with Ministry of Defense. Anyway, so we understood that this conference might be interesting because there could be some other years when they participated, and they also can like put something else as a place where they work. So we contacted with several hundred people who participated in this conference and asked them to send us the papers of the conference to look for the participants. And 2 of these like 300 people really brought us some papers, sent us some copies of these papers, and we indeed found that in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, Georgy Petrovich Roshka also participated in this conference, and he mentioned himself not as a person who works for Evrika, but a person who is serving in military unit number and some number. And when we started to research what is this military unit, we actually understood that this is a GRU unit which is responsible for cryptology. And we also independently checked and understood that we know some other people who are served in this military unit and who also were people who serving for GRU. Right after our investigation was published, Vladimir Putin, for some reason, made a comment that, well, the idea was that you can put any name into like electronic letter or electronic document, so it doesn't prove anything. So he didn't mention Roshka or this case, but for some reason it was like directly this next day or like in 2 days. And idea was that, well, Donald Trump was right, and every like it could be like a thick guy sitting on a sofa in Brooklyn, like for some reason hacking Russian oppositioners, I don't know. But the problem with this theory is that, yes, you can put a name of Georgy Petrovich Roshka into metadata, but first of all, you need to understand, and Georgi Petrovich Roshko works for GRU, and not every fat person in Brooklyn knows that. And another second reason, which is most important for us, is that if it was a provocation by CIA, for example, they would never know in advance that the insider, first of all, would find this name in metadata because it was like accidentally, and secondly, they would never know that we would find who this person is, because it also was very good luck for us. So they, if they would make a provocation, they would make a provocation with some unknown name of a hacker or something. They would put some more evident trace. So I think for us and for everybody who is aware of this investigation, this could be like 100% proof that we know that at least some people from GRU are directly involved in this hacking. And this is also important because this group, Fancy Bear, is also, and I think other experts from cybersecurity organization will explain the details. So we know what are the attacks of Fancy Bear, for what other attacks Fancy Bear is responsible. So they have like kind of fingerprint when they make the hacking sense. It's easy to understand where it was there and where it were some other groups. So that means that in American elections, we also see the trace not just by some people, but people from GRU, because it also was Fancy Bear. The same is in almost every European country. We saw some attempts of Fancy Bear to interfere in elections or in some other politically motivating hacking. And so I think it's a good time to give opportunity to our cybersecurity experts explain what does it mean.
So our next incident will be explained by Tony, but before that, I just wanted to do just a very quick recap, which is sort of the highlight of Roman's story, in my opinion, was that hackers screw up. Nation-state actors are not gods, and there's this idea in certain parts of foreign media that that Russian hackers are the greatest hackers, that they're somehow creatures from the Matrix, and that everything that they do is planned 1,000 steps ahead. And this is at odds with the lived experience of the people who have been following these state actors for years. Not only have we seen them screw up, but we've seen them learn from their mistakes. We've seen them behave in different ways based on those mistakes and based on getting caught. And this leaves us with the question of how do we know that the mistakes that we find were not left there for us to find? How do we know that this isn't a setup, this isn't a provocation? And what you really need to do in this case is apply Occam's razor. You need to think about all of the things that need to come together in order to make that be true, and how your attacker would behave if they were trying to, plant evidence or point the finger at somebody else. And I think Roman has made a very strong argument for why this is actually the GRU and not some other actor like a 300-pound hacker in his parents' basement in Brooklyn pretending to be the GRU for reasons that we do not understand. And with that, let's move along to our next incident. Ms. Tony?
Why, thank you. Also, there are still a whole bunch of seats over here for the guys in the back if you want to take a seat. So that was an excellent introduction. I think what I'll do is I'll kind of move backwards from the point that where Roman picked up. So when we do this type of analysis, when we're looking at the technical evidence, there are certain things that we're going to be able to tell from the tracks that are left after an attack. And what a lot of times we're going to do as researchers is to piece this together with other known evidence for where there are overlaps, what is novel, what is different, and how can we sort of turn over the rocks that will help us figure out who might be behind an attack. And depending on how that attack was carried out, sometimes that's very easy if the attacker was particularly sloppy. sometimes it's a lot more difficult. A lot of times, and I think what a lot of the Russia research shows is that you get some pretty good leads that come out of the technical analysis, but it's going to come to a point where you can only take that so far based off of the technical indicators alone. And the work that Roman and his team have done in terms of taking that, as investigative journalists is what helps really close the loop to pull together a really, really compelling case. But taking a step back from that, let's talk a little bit about some of these phishing attacks. And so, as Eva said in the introduction, one of the reasons that phishing is so important is that it is the prelude and the entry step for almost all of the big attacks that we tend to look at. And that can be, a large organization like the Democratic National Committee, and it also applies to journalists and civil society activists. And the reason that even, very advanced nation-state actors do this is because it tends to work. We like to open emails. We like to click on links. These are ingrained behaviors in the way that we use the internet. And of course, attackers want to use that flexibility, that ease, that intuitiveness against us for their own evil purposes. And so what we've seen is a very consistent tactic here of this. Quick show of hands, who's heard of Fancy Bear before? We have done our job as a community, guys. Okay, we're done. No, it's a very catchy name. So hats off to the CrowdStrike team for coming up with that one. First of all, I want to apologize. All of the cybersecurity companies tend to come up with their own names for the same groups, and that makes following this unnecessarily difficult. And I'm sorry for that. There's nothing I can do about it. So when we talk about Fancy Bear, you may also hear us say APT28. Same group, just a different name based off of whose lexicon you prefer using. So back to those phishing attacks, though. So we saw, right, in the case of, the DNC hack, which was initially discovered, working backwards, they found the malware and then eventually figured out that the phishing campaign was how the attackers had initially established a foothold into their network. When we talk about this type of malware, a lot of times we'll hear questions like, oh, well, that could, anybody could pick that up off the internet. And that's not, sometimes that's the case, but a lot of times when you're looking at these types of examples, you're looking at unique malware that is usually only known to be used by one particular type of group. When you get that, it's a very strong suggestion of who is behind this attack. And so, for example, when we look at the DNC, that's what was found. 2 different Russian threat actors had gotten into the networks using custom malware. So not stuff that's going to be launched, in every Nigerian prince email, that you would find in your normal spam filter. And that's very significant as a starting point for researchers. And then similarly, as we started to dig into this further, we found other indications that suggested that this looked like this Fancy Bear group. The original research was published by CrowdStrike, which is the company that was called in to clean up the breach. And this is something else that's kind of weird about our space here. We tend not to coordinate as researchers. We publish our findings, and there's more of a peer review system. So when you publish something, you put out the technical indicators that allow another team to validate that work and expand upon it. And if you don't do that, you get a flag thrown because researchers get very cranky. We're not the type of industry where you can just say, trust me, I'm right about this. And so that carries over into that burden of proof when we're presenting this work. So in this case, the whole community was able to take those indicators that had been shared out from that attack to validate whether or not we thought that was right. And the overwhelming sense from a lot of firms that are basically frenemies, like sometimes we're cooperative and sometimes we're competitive, was that this checked out. That the evidence that was published was consistent with a known body of knowledge and a body of attacks going back years attributed to this particular Russian threat actor. And it started with phishing, so pivoting from that malware back to the phishing. What we saw these actors doing was using spoofed Gmail emails to harvest passwords. So raise your hand if you heard about this or if you've seen articles about this. Okay, some. There's a really, really great piece that the journalists at Motherboard did about how John Podesta's email got hacked. This is basically the same attack pattern. And it's one that we've also seen used against journalists. Our team at Threat Connect has done a lot of work with the Bellingcat investigative journalists and the campaigns that they have sustained for years from these same actors using spoofed Gmails to get credentials. Sure, it's basically a fake email that looks like one that it's not. So what they're trying to do is come off looking like Gmail security. And again, what they're trying to do is trick you into using your good security awareness against yourself. So what would happen is that the victims would get emails pretending to be from Google Security saying, hey, there's been suspicious activity in your account. You know, someone logged into your account from Ukraine. Of course, you don't live in Ukraine, and that's obviously suspicious. So click here and re-enter your password. So you click the link and it takes you to a landing page that's got your username in it. So again, this looks credible. It's a very convincing fake and gets the user to give up their password. It's that simple. So, you know, and we also have this image, as Eva said, of, you know, these godlike hackers using super sophisticated attacks, and it's zero-day vulnerabilities all the way down. Most of the time it's not. It's something that straightforward as a fake email that tricks you into giving up a password. And if you don't have a second factor of authentication set up, now you've lost control of your inbox, and that attacker can get access to everything that's in your inbox and daisy chain that to any other accounts that use your email for recovery, which for most of us is a good chunk of our online footprint. So these types of attacks are real, and they're effective, but they're also easy to defend against. So I think that this is something that we also want to talk about as a community, because there are lots of ways to make these types of attacks of less use to the enemy, so that you guys can do your job. I don't know if you want to go into that now, or we can hold on to that for later.
Well, here, we can cover a little bit of that right now. Tony, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you can tell whether or not an email is spoofed?
Sure. So a lot of times what you're going to see are the from is going to be obscured. So you always want to hover over that to see if what shows up in that from email sender is actually what it looks like. So in the case of these emails, right, it'll look like Gmail security. But then when you look a little further, you're like, wait a minute, this isn't Gmail at all. So taking a second to think about that is always a good first step. Same thing, that those links that they'd ask you to click would be shortened with bit.ly. So you know, just like you see all over the internet, you'd see bit.ly, you know, and then you click on it. And if you looked at the full link, again, you'd see Google Security.ml/ you know, I'm fake login, I'm evil, don't click me, right? When you hover over that bit.ly link, if you took that second to look at it, you would realize this is not what it pertains to be. But even that, I'd say first and foremost, a service like Gmail is never going to email you asking for your password. So if you do suspect, and lots of us would have plenty of reason to suspect that there's been suspicious activity and we might want to change our password, just navigate to it from Gmail itself. Don't click the link, right? That way you're always going to be going to Gmail's portal with these type of attacks. If it's not, then we've got something else going on, and you know, we can deal with that then. But navigating from the Gmail portal to the security settings to look at and change your password is the right way to do that. Then you don't even have to worry about some of that other stuff.
One of the other things worth noting about the pattern of phishing that Tony is talking about is that user research has shown that users are not very good at identifying domains. So you tell people, make sure it came from Gmail, and it turns out users aren't very good at that because they're just looking for Gmail somewhere in the domain string, and they're not looking for it as the domain name. So one of the things that I've found particularly useful when it comes to training people in avoiding phishing is showing them sort of a gallery of phishing and showing them how one looks for the domain name. Like, I will show them many examples and I will play a game with them. Stranger and weirder URLs going, so show me where the domain is. Show me where in the string the domain is, over and over and over again until they understand where it is. Because this sort of thing is extremely obvious to engineers, and it turns out it is not obvious to users. And engineers are very bad at figuring out what it is that users don't know, especially if it's something that's very straightforward and obvious to us. Basically, we're terrible teachers. All right, so the next incident that we're going to talk about is going to be brought to us by Cosimo.
About the phishing, what struck me looking at some recent phishing examples is how persistent they are. You might be getting a couple of emails saying that your account has been compromised or so forth. So if the first one doesn't work, they'll try a couple of times. I'm basing this on a pro-Russian group called Cyber Berkut. How many have heard of Cyber Berkut? They portray themselves as a false hacktivist persona. We believe that they have ties with APT28, the Fancy Bears. Anyway, they leaked a document not long, a couple of months ago, or emails from a Ukrainian nonprofit CEO. And what struck me was how many of these phishing attacks were sent to that person. That person was eventually compromised, and we got the leaked emails. Another thing to keep in mind is regarding phishing. Certainly, they're going to target your professional email account, your personal email account, and they may also do phishing attacks not via email but through other methods. I got a suspicious text message a few months ago saying that my Facebook post was blocked and that I had to Facebook to correct it. Only I don't use Facebook, so to keep in mind, it's not just via email. It could be text messages. It could be other forms, other platforms. But my expertise is on the disinformation side of things. So what typically ends up happening is you've got these espionage groups like Fancy Bears that through a phishing attack are able to get into a system. They can conduct their espionage operations, and then they can pass on that information to another entity. And the entities that I'm referring to are what we call false hacktivist personas. So hacktivists are hackers who are motivated by, for example, anti-establishment ideology. You know, the anonymous collective folks, they tend to be low sophistication. They're against oil companies, for example, or pro-Greenpeace, all sorts of ideologies. These are the hacktivists that we analyze and so. What these false hacktivist personas are, these are personas that are associated with these state espionage groups, is they portray themselves as hacktivists and leak data that they acquired through, for example, these phishing compromises. And there are many examples of these. In 2016, at FireEye, we identified 6 false hacktivist personas: Guccifer 2, DC Leaks, a couple Anonymous Poland, and so forth. And what a lot of these had in common was that they appropriated the identities, for example, of Anonymous. We have 2 examples of this. In 2016, Anonymous Poland, they pretended to be part of the Anonymous Collective. And we saw this again in 2017 with another group claiming to be Anonymous Bulgaria. And they leaked damaging documents on social media. And we saw similar patterns. They would direct their messages at key influencers, journalists, bloggers, civil society members. We also saw tactics that were common among these false hacktivist personas. They used what we called war listing, which is a rapid-fire method of getting their message across, and they did this on Twitter. And this keeps happening. Just a few days ago, the false hacktivist persona Fancy Bears, not to be confused with APT28, but it's a persona that on Twitter uses the name Fancy Bears. They also have the Guy Fawkes mask on a bear. They purport to be a hacktivist collective, and yet they frequently leak documents, and the targets are consistent with what would be of interest to the Russian government. Most recently, just a few days ago, they targeted the Swedish anti-doping authorities, and so they leaked those documents. A couple of things I want to, just a few more thoughts that I want to say. I mentioned that in 2016 we identified these 6 false hacktivist personas. They were very active in promoting their leaks. They directed their messages to influencers, bloggers, and so forth. More recently, with the Anonymous Bulgaria persona that we saw in 2017, what they did I thought was very interesting. Instead of themselves blasting out their disinformation to the key influencers, they leveraged American conspiracy theorists. They tapped into niche segments of the American population who were susceptible to this disinformation and had them, in turn, disseminated for them. So what we saw with this anonymous Bulgaria persona is that they sent direct messages to some American conspiracy theorists, and we know this because the American conspiracy theorists went on Facebook and said, look, I got contacted by anonymous Bulgaria with these leaks. These leaks purport to show that the U.S. government, that the CIA are funneling weapons all over the world to help terrorists. And so the American conspiracy theorists themselves spun these theories, disseminated them. They had volunteers who were affiliated with them, and they in turn did this. So what we're seeing is that these state-sponsored groups are very in tune with segments of, in this case I'm looking at the American population, and they know who to target to have them in turn disseminated. Roman talked about the Emmanuel Macron leaks. What struck me about that is that the leaks were dumped on the 4chan. How many have heard of it? Yeah, it's a platform, a very popular platform. They were dumped on there, and members of the alt-right community started pushing it. So you don't necessarily need trolls. We have Andre will look at we'll discuss the Internet Research Agency. There are the state-sponsored trolls, but if you can tap into people who will do it for you, like the alt-right or American conspiracy theorists, then that message will go very far. Thanks.
Oh, I just thought that in addition to this, I wanted to ask a quick follow-up question, which is, why would the Russian government target Swedish anti-doping authorities? Because this seems like something not our entire audience might be familiar with.
Well, the big thing, of course, is the Olympics. The shame that Russia incurred not being allowed to compete initially with the track and field team in Rio, and then subsequently in South Korea. So there's a national pride that goes along with that, and the accusation, of course, by the rest of the world is that Russia was involved in massive, large-scale doping. But if they can spin it differently, if they can say, no, look, Sweden, in this case, I think they were trying to, with these most recent leaks against Sweden, they were trying to show that Swedish athletes had in turn been using medications much more so than they should have. So they're spinning it to show that other countries are in turn guilty of doping.
And one quick follow-up question about sort of U.S.-based conspiracy theorists. Would you characterize those conspiracy theorists as strictly on the right or also on the left?
I hesitate. The majority of the ones I've seen are alt-right. That's not to say there aren't any on the left, and that's not to say that they wouldn't leverage the ones on the left. I think they would leverage anybody who can push their message across. Some are conspiracy theorists, period. I don't think they would...
The Alex Joneses of the world.
The Alex Joneses and so forth. And I don't think they would necessarily pick an ideological side. But that'll work for disinformation.
In Britain, they use often like left-wing conspiracy theories and just radicals, and at the same time they use people in continental Europe with a totally different ideology, because they really don't care about ideology. They care about people who are anti-establishment, anti-European integration, and so on and so on.
So I think the big takeaway on our sort of introduction to disinformation is that disinformation makes strange bedfellows, because the government will target people on the left, they will target people on the right. All that they care is that they're anti-authoritarian or that they have a particular stance towards the U.S. government or the Swedish anti-doping authority, and as long as you're willing to buy into that, they don't really care who you are. Cool. All right, so our next description of an incident is going to come from Alexei.
So you said it right. Like, these groups, Fancy Bear especially, is far from being perfect. They are making mistakes. We've seen phishing attacks with so many mistakes. We saw some like a Christmas card coming from the elves with lots of mistakes. Even in ho ho ho, there was a typo. We've seen emails spoofed. They were supposed to be coming from a NATO official. There was typos in United Nations, like they were writing United Nations. Like it's pitiful. But other campaigns that they are launching are much more involved and actually much more costly to deploy. And I want to talk about one of them that occurred last year that we analyzed at ESET. By the way, what we do the most is analyze the toolkits, Fancy Bear's toolkits, so they don't use only one malware family. They will use different ones, totally distinct for different types of attacks. They will use, for example, first stage malware that will just do some reconnaissance on the target and see if it's interesting or not. And as they get more interest, they will deploy more complex and more involved payloads. So this attack was launched in April of 2017. It was against an employee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Romania, and this is already public. I'm not disclosing anything sensitive here. The phishing email was well done this time, and there was an attachment, a Word document, and the content of that document was a text about the US attack in Syria. So they launched a missile strike in response to a chemical attack that happened in Syria. And we analyzed that document that triggered one of our hunting rules because there was part of the document that matched on one of the first stage components that we already understood that was built by Fancy Bear. And inside the document, after about 10 days of analysis, we discovered that it was exploiting two different zero-day vulnerabilities. One, remote code execution on Microsoft Office, and a privilege escalation in Windows. Of course, we reported everything to Microsoft. They patched it maybe 10 days afterwards. But we looked at like what's the value of these vulnerabilities that were used, because once a vulnerability is discovered and is fixed, the value drops. Like you cannot use it as effectively as you could. You can still use it because people don't maintain their software up to date, but the value drops significantly. And I just based my numbers on the Zerodium payout table. Zerodium is a company that will buy your exploits. You send them the proof of concept and they'll pay you a certain amount of money. And for these two exploits, it can be worth up to $80,000 US. And just that was used just for one campaign. We're not sure how many targets were there, but still it was just a one-time deal. Like you do the attack, the vulnerabilities get discovered, fixed, and then they move on. So lots of campaigns are done on the cheap. Some are done with a lot of financial resources behind. So it varies from one day to another. I want to talk about how we can know an attack is being done by Fancy Bear versus another one. My opinion slightly differs from Tony in the sense that yes, we know their tool set. Some of their tools have been used or deployed for the first time like 10 years ago. And we track the evolution, the development, new features, bug fixes in the malware version every month actually. So we know that the same people are behind it. They're developing their software. But some of their malware, actually the source code was leaked for a little while on the internet, and we know that people gain access to it. So that's only one part of the equation. So if you see this actual malware, it's called Xagent. Just seeing the presence of one of the group's tool on a compromised system does not equal Fancy Bear is responsible for the attack. You need to look at the broader picture, and you said it well, like you need, in order to attribute deeper, you need to correlate these technical findings or artifacts with other means, like the work Roman is doing. So that's very important. Before jumping into conclusion, you see one clue, oh, that's Fancy Bears, the Russians. Hold on, things might be more complex. Yeah.
All right. So one additional takeaway from Alexei's sort of presentation is that to beware of ODE. I know that there's a lot of sort of fear, uncertainty, and doubt spread around the use of zero-day vulnerabilities, but you don't often see them deployed by nation-state actors. And the reason why you don't see them is because they give away so much about the actor, and because you can't reuse them. So it's very expensive, and who wants to spend that much money on a target when you can get them to like click on a phishing link? And so one of the ways in which companies like ThreatConnect and FireEye have managed to attribute these attacks to APTs 28 and 29, Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, all the dancing bears, is through the use of these ODE vulnerabilities. So if you're a nation-state actor out there, just like go easy on the ODE. It makes it easy to identify you. And finally, we're going to have Andrei talk a little bit about the troll factories of Russia.
Well, because all my colleagues, they told about hackers, but the topic of this panel, there is about disinformation, so I just want to cover how trolls use this information in the massive social media activities. I mean, information that were published basically by WikiLeaks after it was hacked. So okay. So last year we made 2 investigations of the Trolls Factory. This is from March, where we covered how they established a special media department. And now they have about 70 million people audience in Russia. This media with official license. I mean, they work like real media. And in the end of this investigation, we first wrote about the activities during, before, and after U.S. elections. In March, we made a huge investigation about these activities with all examples and gathering how many rallies, how many audience they covered, and so on. That's it. And yes, when leaked emails were published by WikiLeaks, sure, massive fake accounts operated by the Trolls Factory or Internet Research Agency, how they are known in the US, they started to spread this information. Like, here is a tweet from Tengop. Tengop was one of the most popular tweets operated by the Trolls Factory. It had about 170,000 followers in Twitter. And even, I think, Donald Trump's son retweeted the tweets. Here they wrote something about Hillary Clinton and Podesta emails. And here is another Tengop tweet about Hillary and all this and information from leaked emails. And by the way, Tengop account was registered to phone number with prefix +7, and it could take 30 seconds to check it with password recovery servers, but nobody did it. So about more than 100,000 Americans followed this Twitter, but it could take 30 seconds to check that it's Russian, because +7 is a Russian prefix. Another very popular account, Pamela Moore, I think it had 700,000 followers. And here is about Julian Assange, who, because WikiLeaks spread Fancy Bear information hacked by Fancy Bear. Also, here's an example how they use this information in one of the most popular Facebook groups. It's Being Patriotic. They had about more than 120,000 likers in Facebook. But basically, sure, these accounts were not made just for spreading of leaked information, and it just was only part of their work. And even if it's just summarize topics of their accounts, like here in Russian, but it's name and number of likers or followers of accounts which are devoted to racial questions, to racial issues. And here are political issues, so you see that racial issues were more popular, but they still used information which were spread by WikiLeaks and got by fancy bear. Also because you see that Pamela Moore was basically also spread this information, and Pamela Moore was account about problems of black people. And here another issues of minorities like LGBT, United Muslims of America had about more than 100,000 likers, and they also spread a lot of this information. Here are screenshots from this. I just put in the search service fancy, and here news, official news, because this official media operated by the Trolls Factory. And this is news about these anti-doping scandals. And here is another media also operated by the Trolls Factory. Here is another media, and also you see that they use this information for domestic problems, but sometimes they will use it for international problems because they establish this media USA rarely. This account is registered to private person, but if you take the same domains with in RU zone, like US really RU, it is registered to their legal entity because they have legal entities called Federal News Agency, and so this is, I mean, if you want to work in the Trust Factory, you can email them. You see, yes, they're going to work for the US and international audience officially. So if somebody wants to change his job, you can apply for this job, I think. and then if somebody isn't, does everybody knows what the Trust Factory is? And raise your hands. Oh, okay. So just quick. Okay, so it is one of the biggest Trust Factory, I think, in the world. Maybe they work from 2013, basically for domestic issues. And when they were established, they had something like translation projects. Like, they wrote comments on the Guardian or I don't know, New York Times articles about Putin, that Putin is a great man. And starting from 2015, they established American department where about 20 people worked during, before, and after elections. But more than 900 people, employees, more than 100 employees work there. So you see that American department was only part of it. They basically work in St. Petersburg, and their budget is about 16 million. It is a figure from 2015. I don't know figures from other years, but I think it is maybe bigger. And 5 million is for Media Factory. And in fact, their activities in the US were not very expensive. They spent $2 million during for 2 years. And their support sponsor is Evgeny Prigozhin. And again, this thing for those who want to work there. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrei. So in order to sort of close this out, I have a couple of questions for our panel. And anyone who wants to answer is welcome to do so. If more than one person has an answer to a question, we'll simply pass along the mic. We have, I think, about somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes remaining for question time, and then it'll be Q&A from the audience for 15 minutes. So my first question is, how do you recommend that people protect themselves or their organizations from these kinds of phishing or disinformation attacks? Anybody want to start? Tony? Roman?
Yeah, first of all, never underestimate how silly people are in terms of their security, digital security, because we have some partners who make trainings, training people against like phishing emails, and they say that there is a, like 100% rule that if you have I don't know 20 person working in an organization, at least like 2 of them always will click on a phishing email, even after they will be very well trained not to do this. So that is a problem of especially big organization, because always you will find at least one person who will click, and right after that it will be easy to use his compromised email to send phishing emails from his emails. Yes, so but still I think the best way is just to explain people about this situation, that they need to use two-factor authentication, and if you do it in Russia, this should not be two-factor authentication that is dependent on your cell phone, because your cell phone also your like SIM card that is produced in Russia also can be used by authorities, and we know such examples. So a good training is a must, even for organizations that are not like closely linked to like politics, because very often they are also used not as an aim, not as a final target, but as an instrument to attack more high-profile targets.
Those are all excellent recommendations. I'd say, even if you work in an organization that doesn't have a huge security budget, there is a lot that you can do to make yourself a harder target. Actually, right this week, the team at Motherboard is publishing a daily snippet of things you can do to strengthen your cybersecurity. And a lot of this is basic hygiene when it comes to the way that you protect your information and that you operate online. So it's things like using strong, unique passwords, and use a password manager, because none of us are capable of generating that many strong, unique passwords and remembering them. Two-factor authentication, if you get nothing else out of this presentation, I would say use two-factor authentication and everywhere you can. Ramon's absolutely correct. There are limitations if you are traveling, or if you live in an environment where you have to worry about the government intercepting those text messages, to use text-based two-factor authentication. There are devices called YubiKeys, which mine is not on me at the moment. They're inexpensive. You can order them on Amazon for, I think, like $20. That is a physical token that you have, so that you don't have to worry about using something that's cell phone based, if that's a concern for you. But strong passwords and two-factor authentication, I think, are foundational things. The other thing to start thinking about is, I would say, preventing the potential damage that could come from an account being compromised. And I will speak from personal experience here. Over the course of the last 2 years and all of the work that we've done on this, one of the things that I've realized is that I'm not particularly diligent about going back and deleting things. And so if my personal email account was compromised, as diligent as I am about these different measures, there would be like 15 years worth of email in there. And so one day, like while I was sitting there watching Netflix, I just started, from oldest to newest, to see like, how do I still need any of this? And at the end of the day, it was like maybe like 50 messages, and not even opening them, just by looking at the subject line, right? Out of thousands, that most of that could just be deleted. So I think there is also, if this is something that's of concern for you, that's a very easy step that's totally under your control in terms of thinking about where your information is and just how much of it is out there. Those little things are all ways to, sort of reduce that attack surface, and also reduce the consequences if something does happen, to make something like that less devastating.
So that's the human factor, or the, limiting the risks created by human users, technology users. It's super hard. We need to repeat over and over again. One training will never be enough. So that's really, really important. There are some technological solutions. They are in no way foolproof. I mentioned before, keeping your software up to date. I feel like a parrot repeating this every day, and I'm gonna still repeat it today, because we see people getting infected through the use of years-old vulnerabilities in software, in plugins. It's so easy to stay updated that I still don't understand why so many people running not necessarily critical systems, but people who have access to critical information are still not better equipped to stay up to date. So the goal is to increase the cost as I mentioned before, increase the cost of the attackers to infect one individual. So if we can, let's say, double the cost, either half of the people will get infected, or they'll have to spend twice as much. Either way, we kind of win a little bit. So.
And one more thing is, I think, not only two-step verification, but also not to make your not only basic, but email with sensitive letters public. I don't mean to publish it everywhere, but I mean don't use it for your Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and other accounts, because we have password recovery system. You can restore 60% of all emails, because of Facebook, before Cambridge Analytica scandal showed first letter of your email name and the last letter of your email, and you could see the whole domain. So if this email is like John Smith at gmail.com, if you see the first letter and if you see the second letter, and you know that the person, so you can get this email and then you can go and hack it. So I think it's better not to use email which is for sensitive letters. Don't use it in your accounts like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
All right, I think we are out of time, and now is the time for Q&A. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, please come to me and I will hand you a mic. You can ask them. Come forward, no pressure. Come. Excellent shoes.
I'm just going to say, otherwise it's awkward. So my question is, my key takeaway from this was that you don't necessarily need trolls if you can find either influencers or communities that will spread the message for you. So I was wondering, I should introduce myself. I'm Federica from Privacy International, and one of the arguments we make is there a relationship between, let's say, an under-regulated data ecosystem where you can easily target people and the way that misinformation spreads? And I would like to hear your opinion about this.
I want to give you some short example from history, surprisingly. I know two most famous conspiracy theories in the world. One of them is so-called Protocol of Zion Thinkers, which is anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, and another is conspiracy theory that CIA shot Kennedy. So both of these conspiracy theory were created and promoted by Russian security services. So the first one in the 19th century, it was invented by security, I don't know how to translate it, security service of Nikolai I, and was first spread in France, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in 1840s. And another one was a KGB special operation, and also it used left-wing American newspapers. So this idea of the government using conspiracy theories to spread fakes is older than internet, and I think is as old as media and like all of we exist, as civilization exists. So we just see new instruments for that, and social networks are extremely convenient to spread this information. So that's why I think that our duty as media is to make people aware of these techniques and do better fact-checking ourselves and teach people how to navigate in this informational space, not to be victims of this kind of governmental attacks.
So to get at what our colleague from Privacy International was talking about, is there anyone here who thinks that greater regulation of the internet is the answer? Hands up. Anybody? More regulating the internet? Will it solve anything? Anyone? Anyone? More educated people? How about we regulate data? What if we regulate data? Data? Regulating? No? No one?
So I think these internet research agency guys and the false actors personas, They're very good at adapting. So you might regulate, they'll come around it, they'll do something else. And I mentioned the ability to leverage these conspiracy theorists, but let's not discount the paid trolls that Andre talked about. We've recently seen that they've moved in St. Petersburg from one location to a bigger location, a nicer location. There are no indications that they're diminishing. If anything, it looks like, yeah, they moved from that one to a big. Okay, so they still have staff there, but they moved to a nicer place as well. So there's no indication that they're diminishing, and they're well paid as well. If I understand correctly, they're paid almost as a doctor, if not more, for Russian studies. For these trolls.
Yeah, just.
So this is my comments definitely from a U.S. perspective here. I think one of the things where we do have a gap is that, particularly when we look at the elections, the rules for foreign-sponsored ads in the print and the broadcast domain are not consistent in the digital domain. And so that's one area where there's a gap based on medium that I think no longer makes sense. That is I'd say a pretty baseline measure. It does not solve this problem, but I do think that it solves part of the problem. But the broader question is certainly, you can't stop conspiracy theories, and the challenge is, I think as a society is to help deprive those conspiracy theories of the oxygen that they need to thrive. And so in that sense, I heard one of the other panelists say this is more about education and awareness and trying to draw the sting from that. That I think is the better approach. Although there are probably some small limited ways where, again, we've got gaps in regulation that could be addressed without breaking the internet.
Yeah, coming back to what Cosima said, yes, they worked very effectively because they spent $2 million for 2 years and made America really now in hysteria about the Russian trolls. Yes, 90 students from St. Petersburg made America be in hysteria. Not, RT State International Russian TV channel has I don't know, the budget is more times bigger, but nobody watches RT in the US, I think. Yes, but these trolls. So yes, they're very good in social media marketing, and that they still have groups in the US with about. I mean, they had by the end of the last year with the audience 1 million people. They still had them, and Facebook couldn't get them. So, and they still work, and somebody reads them and follows them.
Just should comment that when we speak about regulation, that already excludes all the authoritarian countries, because regulation is in the hands of the people who are spreading all of that. So that question has no sense there, at least.
All right, I think we can take one more question. Let's. Oh, come on. This is what you get for being bold and sitting in the front row.
Hi, David Gilbert from Vice News. We've seen Russia do a lot of this stuff, and obviously there's been a lot of focuses in the US, but recently in Ireland, where I'm from, there's an abortion referendum happening next week, and there was actually disinformation campaigns taking place by US groups who are paying for Facebook ads spreading disinformation there. What I want to get the panel's opinion on is, are we going to see more of what Russia did but done by other countries against other countries? Is this going to be a template for other countries to kind of, do this kind of disinformation warfare in the coming years?
All right. Does Russia have a monopoly on information warfare, ladies and gentlemen?
They're the big ones. They've been doing it for years, from Soviet Union times. They're very good at what they do. That's not and that's our primary focus. It's possible that other nation states will copy them. I would be very surprised if they're not already doing it. So yes, but you have to also look at the political considerations around it. Who has the most to gain? So who's most likely to do it? In March, Skripals were poisoned in the UK, and we saw a Russian disinformation campaign not only happening on Russian media like RT and Sputnik, but also by what we believe are Internet Research Agency trolls on social media. Why? Because that was a subject that hit home to Russia. So if this Irish referendum hits home to a particular state, I think they would be the most likely to get involved.
Remembering everybody forgot about one case which also took place before the elections, this Macedonian case. Several Macedonian guys from small city in Macedonia, Velis, established more than 100 groups, and they also were very popular. Washington Post and Wired reported it, yes, and they earned money on advertising, and they really pushed fake news like Hillary Clinton is dead, and everybody visited that website and they earned money. So I believe that Macedonian state was not behind this case, but yes, these principles and this system can be used by any other state.
Next question. Anybody? Who have we got? Who is brave enough to come forward? Come on in.
That's all right. Hi, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the difference between domestic disinformation tactics versus foreign disinformation tactics. So when Russia is trying to influence their own population versus when they're trying to influence an outside country.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we think of the focus here in the U.S. is them targeting us, but we shouldn't downplay the amount of disinformation that happens from agencies like the Internet Research Agency domestically within Russia. They've got whole departments whose focus is Russian. Before the latest Russian presidential elections, we at FireEye were tracking how the Internet Research Agency on YouTube and VK, the Russian, if you contact you, the Russian equivalent of Facebook, how the Internet Research Agency was very aggressively seeking to discredit political opponents of Putin, Navalny. They were also discrediting the Communist Party leader. So there's a lot of disinformation happening domestically as well. And by the way, we're still seeing that on YouTube. And there's a great bunch of volunteers in Russia called the Observers, and there's been a couple of newspaper articles on them. These are volunteers who are tracking the Internet Research Agency. They've got their own VK page, they've got their own YouTube page, and when they see suspicious accounts, they flag them. So if you want to learn more about the Internet Research Agency's domestic targeting, I recommend taking a look at the Observers.
Anyone? Yeah.
And if we speak about like foreign disinformation campaign, yes, Russia maybe is the most prominent example. But if we speak what is done inside the country, there are actually dozens of examples, like China, North Korea, Azerbaijan, some other Central Asian countries, Turkey. I'm not sure, but I believe that in some African countries we can see the same thing. And actually in China there are much more, even in some democratic countries like South Korea actually. And in China they are even much more like better prepared than in Russia. For example, there is a special application that if you are like a troll, you have to download to get instructions or what like messages you should spread. So this is very like technologically like profound and well done. So Russia even have to learn about this more. And about differences in is also in message, because we see the same troll farm in St. Petersburg, and they have like foreign department and department that works for inside, and the whole discourse is very different. So the topics that they are promoting abroad have nothing to do with the topics that they're promoting inside, and this is the same we see in media, for example, because and with politicians, for example. So what Putin tells abroad is not the same that he tells inside the country. What Russian media that works for abroad have absolutely different agenda. So that is very easy to understand why, because Russian population has a little bit other values and topics they want to discuss, and it becomes more and more profound. So I mean, they try to aim very different groups, and sometimes in the same countries they work with radical left and radical nationalists at the same time with different messages, but in the same time. For example, in America, we know it because of Mueller investigation, but actually it was known earlier because of leaks from Troll Farm, that they organized a political rally in America where alt-right went to like a square against left-wing organizations, and they there were two demonstrations in one city. So the idea was to organize some clash of people with different values, right? And well, pretty professionally done actually, and it worked. And only now we know that were they behind that.
I just want to give everybody a round of applause. Thank you so much to our panelists. Excellent work. You can talk to any one of our experts once they come down from the stage. Please don't mob them all at once because they're so fabulous. And thank you so much.